Hey guys, we're all set here. This is going to be the first of the new set of video lessons for this week. As I mentioned last week and put up, I'm going to break each of the videos you watched earlier in the week, break those down each into separate videos. So there's actually going to be 4 of these posted. They're going to be obviously briefer than the other ones, where some might be very short, some might be a little longer, just however much I have to go through on the topics. But I wanted to bring up and have you guys look. I have the whole document. It's going to be one PowerPoint that's going to be up on the site. It's going to be on Schoology and on my website. But I'm just going to take each specific video here into individual videos I record to go over with you guys, and you can play them back at your leisure, as these will be posted either late Wednesday night or early some point Thursday morning. So like I said, 4 videos you had for this week. One was from the World History playlist. The other 3 were from the different European history playlist. That obviously has a little more narrow view in terms of doing European history, but kind of covers some of the big topics. So we're going to start with the world history episode, though. This is probably the last piece connected to the stuff we were doing before we left school, before the closure, and that was the part on imperialism. Now, we had the projects from right before we broke. Each of you in groups was covering different part of the world, different events that had happened, and some of you that were looking at Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Others had countries that were involved in parts of Africa or parts of Europe, all over. This is kind of looking at it, again, generally kind of big picture. We could probably take even the stuff in this video and all the stuff related to imperialism, late 19th century, early 20th century, and break it down into multiple videos if we wanted. We're just, going over kind of in a very general way some of the really big stuff. And a lot of this really is precursor to the whole set of videos we're going to have next week, which is going to be on World War I. Again, coming at it from a variety of perspectives. These are some of the factors in the world situation that built up to the point where we had World War I. There was a line right from the start that John Green had in the video that even in the intro and just kind of meant as a, somewhat humorous line, but it has a lot of meaning behind it, where he was talking about taking the empire to new heights or new lows, depending on your perspective. And that's kind of the key here. We do focus a lot, and rightly so, looking at the good and the bad from this. And you have to, if you're being honest about how the imperialist countries, the dominant powers in the world, what they did in these areas that they became involved with. There were benefits that came from it. There were also terrible things that came from it. So I'm going to try to cover all sides of that. He uses the example of Europe interacting with China kind of early on. And there's a couple key points there, and certainly stuff that still relates back to today. The fact that for quite a while, Europe had to rely on the silver it had because they didn't make anything else that China needed. China, for quite a long time, was able to do very well on its own. If you're going way back in history, the creation of the Silk Road, the silk that they provided spices once, and we're going back to like Marco Polo visiting China and what they found and brought back. They were a constant source of trade with much of the world. Then opium came around, and the demand for it in China spiked. That was something that kind of created the balance leaned a bit more towards Europe in terms of favorability with that product. Obviously, we still talk about opium or drugs in general and the quote unquote markets that exist for them now. It is somewhat an economic concept, but it's also based on policies that nations of the world have. If you look to a modern example, something like Colombia in South America, you can't talk about part of the history of that country and other countries' interactions without talking about the drug trade. Even opium now in a place like Afghanistan. And there's a combination. It's not boiling, even this point is not boiling it down simple enough to say, oh, the Chinese people really like opium or whatever. There's also a market for that around the world. This was just something that caused this change at the time, to the point, and I was not even familiar with this event before, what we're kind of casually calling the Chinese Opium Party. As John described, basically sounding exactly like the Boston Tea Party, the throwing of the opium into the water, prompting a fairly lengthy conflict with Britain specifically, and a treaty that ended up hurting China quite a bit afterwards. But there was all sorts of questions about, the trade balance, the trade practices. When you have a product maybe that's demanded or that puts you in a prominent position in the country, then, how do you handle selling that? What policies do you have towards the country now that you're selling that? So it's an important piece to keep in mind. Probably one of the biggest things we look at with imperialism, and we did cover this before we left, was what was referred to as the scramble for Africa. The fact is, for several hundred years before, European countries were unsuccessful in colonizing, and we're talking the continent. There was trade done in Africa, certainly, most notably with the slave trade on the coastal territories / countries or empires. But as far as Europe having a dominant role in the continent, they were not able to do it. They encountered diseases that they couldn't handle, whereas the African population there could. Those diseases also affected the horses. Makes it a little hard to go inland when you don't have your horses. Plus, they ran into people with weapons. Eventually, by the time we get to the late 19th century, and then into the early 20th century, European colonization became powerfully successful and dominant. All the reasons listed you see on the PowerPoint here, everything from industrialization, nationalism, controlling the means of production, basically controlling the land where you get stuff from, the labor force, how you're making things, technology and industrial technology, things like steamships, quinine medicine, to be able to deal with some of the diseases there. Obviously, guns, the more powerful weaponry that they started having. And all of these things led to this absolute dominance for Europe and Africa. The quote at the bottom, industrialized nations push economic integration upon developing nations and then extract value from those developing nations just as you would from a mine or field you owned. There's a lot of debate over the idea of imperialism. And I've watched a number of debates between, political minds and writers and such, talking about the motives behind a lot of it, because there are often a lot of political motives that can go with it. A country saying we are trying to help this territory or this group of people. We're trying to push them away from this terrible leadership that they have. We're trying to help them out. But a lot of times that does carry with them, in many ways, economic benefits. You can take any of the countries we've already looked at, whether it's Britain, France, Portugal, the United States is part of it too. Businesses allowed to operate in territories where the country has an influence, and then they profit off of it. And maybe some of it goes to the people, usually not a lot, but it's that power dynamic that has a real impact. Now, part of that, and I thought this was covered very nicely in the video too, was the conversation about how they did the rule. This wasn't always a matter of every country just having a huge military presence in the territories they oversaw and basically ruling with the old phrase is like ruling with an iron fist, ruling real powerful. No, there were a lot of times where intermediaries, collaborators, sometimes some of the rulers themselves in those countries, in those territories, were helping out, were being the de facto representatives for that country. Probably the most prominent example, and John Green goes through it a lot, is the British in India. Britain held India as a colony for a very long time. There are still resentments over that history because of the way they ruled and the fact that it was a lot of the native Indians, and we're talking the country here, that were in some ways kind of doing the bidding of the British. And the question was raised, and very appropriately so, well, why were they doing that? And one of the simplest reasons you can look to is, well, they were still in charge. They still ruled over either a portion of a country or the country itself, and got to benefit from it. They got the advantages that came with that. Maybe they agreed to some degree with what was going on. There were any number of factors that would allow these people to, in essence, kind of serve Britain. They would still dictate what would happen. They'd have representatives from Britain maybe there, or communication with the British government. And we're talking specifically Britain as the example in India, but this happened with a lot of countries, in Europe. France did the same thing, that you rely on the people you have there. Sometimes it was a threat. There was the concern for the rulers there that if they didn't go along with what the European country was saying, they'd probably die, or they'd be forced out of power, and a lot of people would be hurt. There was an intimidation factor easily that could happen there. Final point to go over with that, though, is, and this was a great quote included in there as well, it's very important to remember that Africans did not meekly acquiesce to European hegemony. They resisted, often violently, but ultimately they were defeated by a technologically superior enemy. I know it's some more advanced vocabulary in there. Acquiesce is basically to give into, and hegemony, European hegemony, is basically dominance by a certain power over another or over multiple areas. So the whole point is that Africa, specifically, as we're looking at all the groups and territories and lands within Africa, it wasn't just Europe came in, European forces came in, or businesses or entities, whatever. You could throw America in there a little bit later. It was Europe predominantly at first. America was more kind of looking a lot at Latin and Central America and South America. But it wasn't just that the Africans went, okay, you're better than us, take it, fine. They fought back. They, in some cases, very significantly. Ethiopia is one of the notable cases where they fought back against Italian attempts to rule over them. Eventually, as we go further into the 20th century, that would be part of what Italy's expansion under Mussolini. So there's a long history there, but they resisted. But in a lot of cases, even with the resistance, they were ultimately dominated, whether it was technology, industrialization, weaponry, everything. It came to just be an advantage for the European powers. And most of Africa and a huge part of Asia fell to it as well. Now, there were specific countries mentioned. That's the last bullet point on there. Keep in mind, too, there are a lot of countries that exist today that didn't exist even at this time. So there's big, areas of territory which would have been countries, but wasn't, at least at the time. The notable exceptions to being taken over were Japan, Thailand, Iran, and Afghanistan. Obviously, very poignant for Iran and Afghanistan in conversation to today. Those were two, Middle Eastern lands that were just not easily taken over or necessarily heavily pursued by European forces, even though there'd be much more of a presence there as we go through the 20th and 21st century. Japan and Thailand, as far as their kind of survival and functionality on their own, Japan actually had its own imperial ambitions. Like, they were becoming stronger and stronger and would throughout the 20th century. Thailand, again, just did not fall subject to that overpowering European force. So we're going to stop it there. Next video, we'll pick up with the first of the European history episodes.